Howdy, my name is Nonat, and Guns and Gears just came out really recently, and with it, we got something very interesting. An entirely new weapon group of weapons. We've been introduced to Firearms, which obviously are the weapon of choice for the Gunslinger class, but should not be overlooked as a viable weapon option for every other class in the game. Anybody who can use ranged weapons can also use Firearms, so yes, Wizard with a pistol is a thing. In today's video, I just want to explain exactly what firearms we got, how they work, how they're different from normal weapons because they are a little bit more complicated. Not that much more, but there's a little bit more to them.
Howdy, my name is Nonat. I finished this video a few days ago and forgot to do a sponsored segment. I'm currently on vacation, so I'm making do with what I've got. So enjoy this special segment I call Sponsor Charades. Did you know that the Battlezoo collection of books by Roll for Combat are available for pre-order right now? If you use the link in the description, you can pre-order them right now. You'll even get a discount. These books look incredible, and they've got a little bit of everything coming out. A full bestiary with tons of new monsters. A completely new ancestry to play as. And even a brand new adventure that takes characters from level 1 to 11. Jewel of the Indigo Isle. I've gotten a sneak peek into the Battlezoo bestiary, and it's all top quality content. From the artwork to the statistics, it all feels like an official supplement. It's got some incredibly exciting creatures that I can't wait to use. My personal favorite easily being the Blood Mouse. He's adorable and I would die for him. So use the link below and check out the Battlezoo line of supplements for Pathfinder 2e. Pre-order today to get them at a discount. The prices will increase whenever they're fully released, and you'll get early access to the PDF versions of the books. Thank you to Roll for Combat for sponsoring today's video. Now I'm gonna back to sleep.
Before we talk about the specific weapons themselves, I want to go over all of the new weapon traits that are in this book. A lot of the weapons we talk about today will have these traits, so it's better to understand them now, and then you'll know exactly what each weapon can do as we talk about them. Starting off, we have capacity. The capacity trait is mostly useful on one-handed firearms. It's a little complicated, so let me explain. The capacity trait will always be followed by a number. This is how many separate chambers or barrels can be loaded at once. For example, capacity 3 means there are 3 separate chambers all loaded with a bullet. After being used to fire once, there are still 2 available barrels. You now have 2 options. You can either take a standard reload action to reload the barrel you just used and fire again, but as per usual, that does require 2 hands. Whereas, if you simply slide over to the next available capacity chamber, that is the same as a reload action, but it doesn't require a free hand. So this allows someone to use something like a 3 capacity pistol and a shield and fire off 1 round and then swap to the next barrel without needing to use both hands, so they can still wield their shield and fire off another round. It's very specific and a little overcomplicated, but it does have its place. Concealable gives you a +2 to stealth DCs to hide the weapon. Simple as that. Really useful on like little tiny baby pistols. Concussive firearms are both piercing and bludgeoning damage at the same time, and it will always take advantage of the lower weakness or resistance. So, if something is immune to piercing damage but has no resistance to bludgeoning, the concussive weapon always does bludgeoning, and vice versa. Double barrel weapons sort of have an interesting option available to them. For a single strike, you can unload both barrels of the firearm. If you do this, both the weapon's damage die goes up 1 step, and the weapon's fatal trait goes up 1 step if it has it. This will require you to reload more often, but your burst damage will be a decent chunk higher. This trait is interesting as it definitely gets better at higher levels when you have multiple damage dice to upgrade. Starting at level 1, a double barrel weapon probably isn't that worth using as a double barrel shot. The Fatal Aim trait is effectively the two-hand trait specifically for firearms. Fatal Aim only allows you to make use of the fatal trait if you are using two hands to stabilize the weapon. So this firearm can be used single-handedly, but if you critically hit, it does not get the effect of its fatal trait. This is also a little bit harder to handle, so it takes an action both to get into the two-handed stance and an action to get out of it, whereas normal two-handed weapons are free to release. Kickback is a fascinating trait. The weapon just permanently does 1 additional damage on all attacks, but you do take a -2 penalty to attack rolls with it. However, as long as your character has at least a 14 strength, they ignore this penalty. It's cool, you're using a weapon with a much bigger kickback, but as long as you've got the body to handle it, it doesn't really affect you. My only complaint is that this +1 damage doesn't scale or improve in any way. Even at level 20, it's only 1 extra damage. Repeating weapons are an entirely new type of reload. Rather than reloading between shots, they actually hold a specific number of shots that can be taken without reloading. This is great, as it means you can possibly attack 3 times in one turn with this ranged weapon without reloading once. However, once the repeating magazine runs out, it is pretty debilitating, as it requires both a free hand and 3 actions to completely replace the magazine. However, it does say that these actions don't need to be consecutive. You can spend 1 action on one turn and 2 on the next to finish reloading. However, if you are in the middle of reloading the weapon is unusable. And finally, the Scatter trait adds a little bit of splash damage. The trait itself is always accompanied by a range, and all creatures in that range, along with the primary target of the strike, take 1 additional damage per weapon damage die. This means that your primary target is taking increased damage, and every other creature within the range listed also takes that additional damage. Pretty cool, just a nice little way for a martial class to do area of effect damage. Firearms, interestingly, have the same crit specialization as the brawling weapon group. If you have crit specialization for firearms and you critically hit a target, they make a fortitude save against your class DC or become stunned 1. Pretty cool, and firearms want to crit, so for the chance to both deal massive damage and knock off one of their actions on the next turn, that's pretty great. The final thing I want to talk about before we talk about specific weapons is misfires. If a weapon is in the firearm weapon group, they are subject to misfires. Now, normally, this is not going to be an issue. The only time a firearm can misfire is if they were used the previous day and were not cleaned. 99 times out of 100, it's going to be implied that during your daily preparation, you spent some of that time cleaning out your firearms. However, if you're being chased or you haven't had time to sit down and clean out your firearms, they are subject to misfires. Every single time you strike with a dirty firearm, you have to make a DC 5 flat check. If you roll that 4 or lower, the attack is automatically a crit failure and jams your weapon. This effectively tacks on an extra action to reload it, 1 to unjam it and 1 to actually reload the weapon. Like I said, typically you'll be able to clean your firearms during daily preparations, but in those really heated moments where you've had no downtime, this can add to a really interesting, suddenly dire scenario. Additionally, there are some feats, namely for the gunslinger, that can cause firearms to misfire automatically even if they're not dirty, but we'll talk about that in the gunslinger deep dive. Alright, now that we understand what we're talking about, let's talk about what you're here for, all the different weapons available to you as new firearms, starting with the Air Repeater. This is a 1d4 30-foot range increment piercing, simple firearm. It's important to note, these first 6, 7 things we talk about, they're all simple, so they're all available to every single class in the game. The Air Repeater has a magazine of 6 pellets, so you get to use this thing 6 times before you need to reload, and it's agile. So if you attack with it twice in one turn, it's only a -4. This is phenomenal. I'm only sad that bow monks are restricted to, well, bows, because a monk with agile air repeaters flurry of blowing would be so cool. The coat pistol is a tiny little 1d4 piercing gun as well, with a reload of a single action, but it does have the concussive and fatal d8 traits. It's also concealable. This is that classic tiny little pistol you can hide in your waistband. It deals piercing or bludgeoning damage depending on which one is better, and on a critical hit it deals d8s instead, plus an additional d8. That's really nice. The Fire Lance is fascinating. It is a close-range, bulky, two-handed gun, but it deals really solid damage. It only has a range increment of 10 feet, so you're basically using this thing in melee. It deals 1d6 piercing damage at base, but does have fatal d10. So at level 1, if you crit with this thing, you're dealing 3d10 damage. Keep in mind though, it's two-handed, it has 2 bulk, and it takes 2 actions to reload. This is really a pull-out, fire, and drop kind of weapon. You probably don't want to reload it mid-combat. Honestly though, aside from saving 2 gold pieces, I don't know why you'd ever use the Fire Lance over the Flintlock Musket. It also deals a d6 piercing as its base damage, but it has a 70-foot range, only costs 1 action to reload, and has the concussive trait. Just like the Fire Lance, it does have fatal d10, but concussive means it's gonna do piercing or bludgeoning, whichever is more, so this is just better than the Fire Lance. It's also not as heavy, only being 1 bulk instead of 2. I honestly don't know the point of the Fire Lance when the Flintlock Musket exists. And of course the Flintlock pistol exists as well. It's another d4 piercing, 40-foot range increment with concussive and fatal d8. Really solid, overall just a little bit better than the coat pistol, but it doesn't have concealable. The hand cannon, I am shocked at how good and versatile this thing is. It is a 1d6 modular firearm with a 30-foot range increment. Because it's modular, for a single action at any time, you can switch it to bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing damage. This thing can just shoot out cutting bullets for some reason. I don't know why. It's really good. Sure, it doesn't have fatal, it doesn't have concussive or anything like that, but it can really take advantage of physical weaknesses if something hasn't, and that's not to be overlooked. And the long air repeater sacrifices the agile trait of the normal air repeater in exchange for a bigger magazine and a double range increment. It has a 60-foot range increment and can hold up to 8 shots before needing to reload, but like I said, it's not agile, so the second shot is going to be at the full -5. And those are all the simple firearms available to us. What's important to mention that I really should have said earlier is that all firearms are uncommon. This means you do need GM permission or some kind of class or character ability that gives you access to these weapons. But now let's move on to the fancy stuff, the martial firearms, starting with the Arquebus, basically a sniper rifle. 1d8 piercing, a 150-foot range increment. That's insane! You can shoot from 300 feet away at only -2. It does take 2 hands to wield, and it is a hefty 2 bulk, but it's still only a single action reload. It does have kickback, however, so keep that in mind. You need at least a 14 strength to avoid that base -2 penalty, so you're gonna have to sacrifice something. You'll want a high dex for the accuracy with this thing, but a medium strength so you don't suffer the penalty from kickback. It does have fatal D12, which is amazing and deals so much damage on critical hits, and it's concussive, taking advantage of either bludgeoning or piercing weaknesses. The blunderbuss is much shorter range, with only a 40-foot range increment, but also dealing 1d8 piercing. Now, while it does lack the fatal trait, it is concussive and has the scatter trait, dealing that bonus damage to all creatures within 10 feet of the primary target, equal to the number of damage die. It's really good. I adore that they have made the clan pistol a thing for dwarves. Dwarves are well known in Pathfinder for their clan dagger, but I had never heard of a clan pistol, and it's super cool. It is a 1d6 piercing firearm with a 80-foot range increment. Wow, that's long. Light bulk, 1 hand, 1 action reload, and fatal d10. That's just amazing. Like, honestly, I keep talking about how great concussive is, because it is great, but it is on most firearms. But that fatal D10 is really good on a one-handed ranged weapon. Again, this is a one-handed ranged weapon that on a crit at level 1 is dealing 3d10. That's insane. The double-barreled musket is okay. It is a two-handed weapon, once again with a single action reload that deals 1d6 piercing damage with a 60-foot range increment. So already a little bit worse than the clan pistol, but it does have the double-barreled trait. But again, this kind of makes it worse than the clan pistol. You need to fire off both barrels at once, and it does get upgraded to 1d8 piercing when you do so, and 1d10 fatal. If you crit without using both barrels, you don't get that fatal bonus. So if you crit with the fatal, it's decent, but a crit with a double-barreled musket will do the same damage as a crit with a clan pistol. Obviously, the clan pistol does have the dwarf trait, so getting a hold of that would be tough, but honestly, I don't really see the point of this. I suppose the point is that it can fire twice before needing to reload. Just like the double-barreled pistol, only dealing a d4 piercing damage and 30-foot range increment, but of course, having that double barrel with the fatal d8. So again, if you fire off both, it's about weaker than a clan pistol, but it does decent damage. It deals a d6 and then fatal d8, or you can fire twice at a d4. I kind of like the option. It's cool to have that option, so I'm here or there about it. The Dragonmouth pistol is just cool because that's a one-handed shotgun. 20-foot range increment for 1d6 piercing damage, and scatter 5 feet. So not as big of a scatter as a normal blunderbuss, but a one-handed shotgun is just too cool to pass up. That might be my weapon of choice. The dueling pistol's a little more expensive, but you definitely get your money's worth here. A d6 piercing with a 60-foot range increment, and concealable and fatal d10. Gonna get those big crits, gonna be able to hide this from the popo pretty easily, and of course, concussive, which I've pretty much stopped mentioning. The Harmona gun is an interesting sniper alternative to the arquebus. It does deal d10 instead of d8, but it doesn't have the fatal trait. So the Harmona gun, on average, is going to be dealing more damage than the arquebus, but one critical hit from the arquebus will launch the total damage dealt. Just so you know, a crit with a Harmona gun is going to deal 2d10. A crit with an arquebus is going to deal 3d12. That's massive. Otherwise, they're just about the same weapon, although the Harmona gun also doesn't have concussive. So I do think the arquebus is better overall, but the Harmona gun will be more consistent. The Jazale? I don't know how to pronounce that. It sounds cool. This is a 1d8 piercing one-handed weapon, which is not to be overlooked. That is solid, and it does have the fatal aim trait we talked about before. This means you can optionally use two hands to aim this gun, and if you critically hit, it has fatal d12. Just remember, if you crit while only using one hand, it's only going to do 2d8 instead of the 3d12. Also, it has a 90-foot range increment. On a one-handed weapon, that's insane. The Mithril Tree is an elf-specific firearm, and they could not have picked a better name for it. This is another sniper option. It only deals 1d6, but it does have the fatal d10 trait, and it has the parry trait. Does parry work against ranged attacks? It does! So if you have the Mithril Tree, you can fire, reload, and then spend your third action to parry and just kind of put it in front of you for a +1 to armor class. I kind of love it. For a more defensive sniper, this is great. The last two martial ranged weapons are the capacity trait I was talking about before. It is only on these two, the pepper box and the slide pistol. The pepper box is only a d4 with a 60-foot range, but it does have that capacity 3, allowing it to be effectively reloaded twice without a free hand, and it still has fatal d8. The slide pistol, pretty similar, 1d6, only a 30-foot range increment. It's a little heavier at 2 bulk, but it's still only a single hand to use, and capacity 5 with fatal d10. These are really cool. Again, I like the idea of a pistol and shield character hunkering down and firing with these while also reloading with the same hand. It's just a cool vision. It might not be like mechanically the strongest, but it's just awesome. And finally, we've been given 2 advanced firearms. Will these be advanced weapons that are worth using? Let's find out. First off, the Dwarf Scatter Gun is a 1d8 piercing scatter weapon with a 50-foot range increment, which for a shotgun is pretty far away, not gonna lie. It is 2 bulk, takes 2 hands, and is a single action reload. It has concussive and kickback. Overall, this is a fancy blunderbuss. It's honestly not even that much better. It's 10-foot farther range increment with kickback. Other than that, the scatter's the same, the concussive's the same. It's just a dwarf-specific blunderbuss, and it's not that much better. And remember, unless you're a fighter with a very specific feat, your advanced weapons are going to be at -2 compared to the rest of your proficiencies. And the final new firearm we've gotten is, of course, a goblin firearm. You knew they weren't going to leave us without something goblin-y. The Fling Flencer is a 1d6 two-handed firearm with a 30-foot range increment. It's sort of another blunderbuss with a 5-foot scatter, but it has backstabber. Let's go read the description of this before we end this off, because why does this gun have backstabber? Also, maybe I didn't say it, it does slashing damage. A Fling Flencer is a goblin-designed weapon ending in an ovoid tube with a hatch and handle on the narrow end. A cluster of circular blades held together and attached to a black powder packet with a thin leather strap serves as ammunition and is loaded through the hatch before being fired with a flintlock or other external ignition mechanism. It's literally a gun, but instead of a barrel that shoots bullets, it's just blades, and the blades get fired out via explosion. I love goblins. And those are all the new firearms available thanks to Guns and Gears in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. There's a lot of really cool stuff here, honestly, a lot of new weapons. Some of them are clearly just weaker or not worth using. I still have issues with advanced weapons which haven't really been fixed or amended here, but I'm excited to play with firearms, honestly, especially as a class that doesn't use firearms. Something like a weapon inventor who uses a firearm could be a lot of fun. Let me know down in the comments what you think. Are you excited for firearms? Are you excited? Is there anything here that really tickles your fancy? Let me know your character ideas that involve guns. This is a weird sentence. I want to give a huge shout out to my patrons for supporting the channel. I really appreciate everything y'all have done for me and helping keep this channel going. There's a link in the description if you would like to support the channel alongside them and get your name in that cool list of people. Thank you all so very much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And until next time, no nat ones.